Dr. Kosali Simon. She is, well, I can't say enough positive things about her. She is a huge supporter of the honors program, teaching courses at an honors level. She has fielded so many honors theses. She's a supreme researcher here at SPEA. She has agreed to kind of do the honors thesis A to Z.
Thank you. So these words here, they take me back to the senior year of college for me when I was writing my thesis. I had been working for my work study for a professor who collected data from Eastern Europe. This is in the early 1990s. And it was really exciting to hear about the work that he did. And it was work that I did for my work study, but I really enjoyed learning about the process of research. So he was collecting survey data from companies in Eastern Europe. At the time, they were going through from communism to capitalism, asking managers and workers about how they were adjusting to the changes. And so these surveys, they came from Bulgaria and got shipped to upstate New York where I was. And I was just a small part of this process. I was inputting data into Excel from these surveys. But I really became very interested in it. And when the opportunity arose, when I heard that there was a possibility of doing an honors thesis, I thought about things that I had thought of while reading these questionnaires, questions I had, and I had this opportunity to pursue an independent research project with that professor as my mentor. So that took me on to be really interested in the economics of companies in transition, and I went to graduate school. And from graduate school, my interest then became a lifelong passion in trying to find data to answer pressing questions in public policy. It became centered in health policy. And here I am in an academic role. I do research and I do teaching in health policy. So that's my story, but each of you will have your own story. And in fact, I want to say congratulations for being here, because that means you've taken that first step in wanting to get more out of your college experience than just what's in the classroom. And I want to, through my presentation, hopefully tell you about things to keep in mind as you are thinking through and following your passions to the completion of a research project. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about today is the following. I'm going to spend a few slides talking about what a thesis is. And the basic message from that is that it can take many different forms depending on the area you're in. I'm also going to spend a little time talking about what you as a student might expect to get out of this experience. And the rest of the time will be spent on steps. What are the actual steps one might take? And tips that you might want to think along the way about. And at the end, I want to have a discussion about what are the kinds of topics you're interested in, maybe follow through building up on the idea that we're going to be learning from each other, trying to get feedback for somebody's research question to see, where might the next steps be on that. So jumping right into what a thesis is, I have a multiple choice question here. So what's a thesis? Is it a semester-long independent research project with a faculty mentor? Is it an original contribution to the scholarly conversation in a particular topic? Is it a capstone to your undergraduate academic experience? Or is it all of the above? And you can see from the way I'm phrasing this question that there's an obvious right answer here. And it is all of the above. It's really a very many ways you can frame what a thesis is, but there's some common themes to all of these. It's a culmination of your experience, of your classes, of the skills. It's a way that you can apply what you have learned to something that you are really, really interested in and you choose. And that also means the fact that you are making this as a choice means it comes along with a lot of responsibility for you to see it through. It's not a class-based project where you have deadlines and structure, where you see the instructor and the other students every week. It means a lot of responsibility is placed on you. So now jumping ahead to, maybe a way to think about what a thesis is to also imagine what that final product will look like. And here, the final product really can take different forms depending on the area you're in. I'm going to be a little broader in this than what I think even SPEA encompasses, but SPEA is pretty broad in what there is. So I've even put fine arts portfolios and computer science. So it depends on the area you're in. If you are in lab science, your thesis will probably take a final form that shows lab experiment results, a description, a discussion. You also have to couch all this in a way that communicates what you have done to others. So you will be explaining why this particular experiment you did was interesting, how you set it up, what led you to formulate your lab experiment in a certain way, what are the papers in this area that motivated you, and how does this contribute to what we know in that field? How does your research push that scholarly area forward? If you're in social sciences, and this is the area I'm most familiar with, being an economist, is the final product is usually a paper that has lots of data, tables, graphs, however you want to communicate the data, results from your analysis, along with text and discussion before and after that couches why this question is important. If you're in the humanities, you won't be dealing with data and analysis of that type, but you'll have text and images and theories and literature you will draw on, probably. If you're in an area like computer science, it could be producing code, producing apps. And if you're in the fine arts, you'd have what's typically thought of as a portfolio of your works. So it can be also very different in the method of inquiry used. Now this is more honing in on what might be SPEA areas outside of the sciences, actually, or lab experiments included. So again, starting off with the area I'm most familiar with, it is quantitative analysis using either secondary data, mostly secondary data, because especially when you're thinking about a semester-long project, it is hard to be generating your own data, but there is that option of doing your own surveys. And but there can also be theses that are written that have analysis not of data, but of qualitative terms. So you could be conducting focus groups and analyzing the themes that come out of it. You could be doing literary searches on texts, and there's a lot of software and methods around how to do qualitative analysis. You could be having lab experiments. There can be a case study approach to your methods, and any combinations. But basically, you are going to be picking the method that is appropriate for your field. So in economics, using a case study or a qualitative focus group isn't going to get you that far because that's not what the field generally does. But if you are in sociology, that's going to be much more accepted. So you're going to figure out, along with your mentor, what is the appropriate type of inquiry to use for the thesis you have in mind. I'm going to describe now what the outline of an end product might look like for the kind of research I'm more familiar with. So this would be a policy topic, a quantitative policy topic, and analysis with data. So it would have a following typical structure. You would start out, and some of these are going to be common no matter what the area is you're studying. You have to be extremely clear in conveying what your question is. It cannot be framed as a broad topic. It cannot be determinants of health or factors that are important in education. It just has to be very, very clear, because you are not going to be able to answer a really broad question in a semester. You're just not going to get anywhere doing that. Often phrasing the topic as a question with a question mark at the end helps you figure out, how do I know when I have actually answered the question? So the question, writing that down, will be what you spend a lot of energy on, because it will keep changing. You will think you can answer this question and you'll discover, no, my methods can't. Or there's a more interesting question in here for you, but you're in the same area. You're just going to be honing on what that question is. The second part is that you have to explain, and you'll have done this in explaining it to yourself because you will have decided this is what I want to follow. Why should anyone care about this question? What is the reason that somebody would want to know the answer, And why is it that I decided this was really important for me to spend a whole semester on? So really clearly communicating the motivation behind why this is an important question is a big part of this. And then in the paper, usually it's good to right away have the summary of what you found. Because you've got the reader interested, you've got them hooked, you've said what the question is and why that's important. In a few sentences, you can give the gist of what you found, and then go on to explain in detail all of the other sections. So then you get into, okay, you're not the first to think of a question in this broad area. There's some prior studies that you use as basis for what made you interested. You might have read somebody else's paper. You might have read something in the news that was reporting on a recent study and that made you interested. So that becomes relevant background to inform the person who is going to read your thesis about. So prior research related to your question, you kind of summarize, what do we already know about related areas? How does that help the reader understand the contribution that you're about to make? So you may decide that there has been a lot of work about the impact of some kind of prison policy on a certain population, but then you realize, oh, they haven't studied older versus younger, or there'll be something in it that you decide, we don't know the answer to this sub-question in this broad area, and you decide, well, that's how you're going to motivate the importance of this by bringing in maybe two areas and say, there are two important findings, but no one has put them together. Somehow you'll make it sound like there's enough context that makes it interesting. Now, having done that, you would typically explain what your hypothesis is. You've been informed by knowing the prior literature and thinking about what might cause the factors you're studying. So suppose you're looking at a policy like the No Child Left Behind educational policies. You might have some idea in mind based on what you have read in the news about whether this was successful or not. Based on, suppose you're looking at long-term outcomes from No Child Left Behind. You might say there's a literature on short-term outcomes, but no one has looked at long-term outcomes. And you might think maybe long-term outcomes are bigger than short-term outcomes because people talk about how this may amplify. So that would be your hypothesis, that you're going in thinking perhaps you're expecting, based on prior research that has shown that changes made early on amplify later in life, that the hypothesis would be that the No Child Left Behind policy has actually made people's outcomes better in the long run. You explain your hypothesis, then you get to the method you are going to use to answer this question. Are you going to, in typical policy studies, use the fact that states do different things at different times? So maybe there's some educational policy that has been implemented at different times in different states or different school districts, and you're going to try and explain how you could use data that is out there and reported by school administrations over time in different states to test your hypothesis. If you are in a lab setting, this is much easier because all you're going to do is say, I had a control group, I had a treatment group, I gave the treatment group the treatment, and I watched their outcomes afterwards. When you're a social scientist and you don't have the opportunity to put human beings and companies into a lab setting, what you're looking for is a method that would allow you to take observational data, just data that is actually what happens in life, and think about a study design. People come up with very clever study designs. So as an example from health, we have not known the impact of interventions that are done in hospitals for very low birth weight babies because those who are really sick receive the extra treatments and those who are healthy don't. So if you can't really tell that it was experimentally given to one group and another, what would happen? Because, and no study would agree to do that because it's unethical. You cannot just randomly give these kind of treatments. But nature provides us with a good experiment here because there are clinical guidelines that are cutoffs. If you happen to be born at exactly 1,500 grams, there are protocols that say you are going to receive this treatment. If you are 1 gram over, you don't. And yeah, there's a little bit of discretion in how that is done, but there are clinical guidelines that set these numbers. There are certain numbers that determine whether you are going to get a transplant or not, how high you are on the transplant list. So we can use these to say people right below and right above, well, they're like clinical treatment and control groups. They're not that different. It's just that some got it and another didn't because of this guideline. So you can use that as a study design. What you are doing is, as far as possible, trying to mimic a lab experiment using just observational data. Sometimes there are actual lotteries in how states do things. In Oregon, there was a Medicaid waiting list. They didn't know how to do something fair to let some people on and not others because they only had limited money. They decided to draw a lottery. This was seen as a great experiment that nature provided, and researchers from Harvard and MIT went there and analyzed the data. And the results from that have been really influential in public policy. They've been in major newspapers and journals, and it was just using a study design that came from nature. Because of budget shortfalls, Oregon decided to do things that way. All right, so I spent a lot of time talking about the method because that's part of what I really love and study is how do we make public policy related research findings from facts that we can't control in the lab. We just have to look at past experience. Having said what your method is, you explain what data you're using, then you discuss the results of your analysis, and you provide some context. Even if you've just reported, oh, I found these results, I ran this regression, or I did this correlation, or I did whatever analysis you're doing, and you report it, you have to make some sense out of it. And so you discuss, well, these are large numbers. This shows a lot more responsiveness in people, in how educational outcomes affect life, or whatever, compared to what others have found before. And then you get to restate the summary, so let me remind you what I did in this paper. I looked at the question of this in this way, and here's what I find, and this is what's important. And then you have references, tables, and all that in the back. So that's finishing that area of what is a thesis. Now getting on to why might you want to take on this semester-long project that is what I'm going to describe as a big responsibility. And that's because there's a lot that I think people get out of it. So first and foremost, it has to be something you are completely interested in. You should not be doing this if you are not, because you will have to love that topic throughout in order to keep with it. So, but if you should think of this as an experience you're going to have fun and intellectual growth out of. Having accomplished it, I expect that you would feel a great sense of confidence in your ability, because this is the first time, perhaps, for some of you, that you're taking on a really big undertaking like this. Completing classes and projects, well, those are accomplishments too, but this is getting to a new level because this was not a requirement of you. This was something you did voluntarily, you took on by yourself, and you accomplished. And it will be a lot of practice in communicating skills, because you're going to have to keep explaining to others what you're doing and receiving feedback. Now, on a more practical level, this gives you a product that you can use as a portfolio of sorts. And you can be using it to convey what you are capable of doing in grad school applications, being on the committees that look at grad school applications. These kind of things make a big difference in us being able to sort out. Otherwise, we just have transcripts and letters. This is actually seeing a product of what you're capable of. It's also very useful in job interviews. Again, sets you apart from other students who would just have a transcript to show, and can be used in professional networking and just trying to figure out for yourself, are you really interested in going into this area? Having something to start off by saying, well, I did a project in which I looked at this, is a great way to start a conversation with someone who's in that area. On to steps. And now, if you are thinking, well, what do I start in terms of actual steps? You'd have to first come up with a topic. You have to think about what is the area, what is the broad area, and think of it as a funnel. You start off with really broad areas and then funnel down to an actual question. What is it that I'm really passionate about? It's really helpful if what I'm going to pick is something that is in an area that I want to pursue. What are the exact questions? That can change as you funnel down, but it must be one that you have you can paste it on your wall, you can have it on your, you just have to have it always as something you're thinking, okay, this is what I'm working towards answering. And this means getting started early on. Think about topics you're interested in, think about instructors who could mentor you in those areas, talk with current thesis students, look at past examples, and attending thesis presentations that are in the spring of people who are finishing is a great way to see what finished products are like. Just a set of general tips I thought I would throw onto one slide. You can look at a finished product as an example. You can even look at one that is published as an example that would be really great. It has met that bar of being accepted. Now, you're not going to aim to get yours to be at a level that's necessarily publishable right away in a semester, but you're practicing getting that. Sometimes people think it's hard to fit in something that's not a class requirement into my day. Just think of not aiming for 2 hours of work on it at a time, but just a little bit at a time. And every time you come back, it'll be a fresh thought you'll have. Getting comments from others on your work. Think of not just your instructor, but other students, friends, and family. You're just trying to get people's gauge on, is this interesting? What is it that they might think is a sub-question that would be useful? And in that light also, think about your 2 or 3 minute version that you have of what you're doing. You can have practiced that because that's a conversation starter with others that will be a great skill to have even later on. I'm just going to mention something that I think is really important to think about in just every scientific pursuit is the importance of reproducibility. That is, if you do some analysis, your work is worth only to the extent it can be reproduced. And so just as a philosophy from the start, make sure that you have done things in a way that document what you do very carefully. It would be terrible if you came up with a great result, but then you didn't remember where you get the data from or what you did to it, and this doesn't look like that you can reproduce. So from the start, if you just approach it by knowing that's something you would do, that really helps down the line. I just mentioned here a few things. I think there are lots of resources on the SPEA Honors website that you can use, but I'd be happy to share these links. You can also look at other universities that have some thesis manuals or books, and there's one book I found that is about writing a thesis. This is, but there are others too that you can look at. So lots of resources, and not something that you're going to go into without resources being available. So just to summarize, the thesis, you can think of it as something that is going to extend your classroom experience because you're taking what you have learned and putting it into the context of something you have a true passion in pursuing on your own. It gives you a tool that you can take in many forms depending on the area you're in. And you should only be pursuing this if you're fully dedicated to it, because towards the end of the semester you will otherwise hate it and not really get that enjoyment out of it. But you're gonna put a lot of work into it, but you also should expect to get a lot out of it, starting early and making sure you have a very methodological approach to organizing your research will pay off down the road. So that's the formal part I prepared.
They can do it, be aware that their time, like the mayor of Bloomington teaches a class here.
Typically, there are 2 ways you might come up with a topic. One might be that even before you came to IU, or some experience you've had outside of the classroom has really triggered this interest in you pursuing a certain question. The other, more common way is that something in class or something about what your professor is researching made you interested. And so if it's that second one, there's more of a natural tie to who it is that would be interested. But if it's the first, you can very easily ask around and say, I'm really interested in understanding the effect of the legalization of marijuana in the states that have recently. Who would be a good professor who would know about this area? So that's a way you would go about it.
How much time would you say one should dedicate towards collecting the data and maybe all that stuff And then also, like, and then how much time should you spend on the writing?
Okay, that's a good question because sometimes the data collection is what bogs you down, especially if that doesn't go as planned and you don't then have enough time to analyze it. There are also a few other complications that are involved with collecting data. It's different if it's the lab versus not. If you're collecting data related to human subjects, you have to make sure you have done all of the human subjects training. Even if you are using secondary data, if it involves sensitive data on individuals, you have to get an exemption from human subjects. So all that needs to be thought through, and the sooner you get started. So if you get started on that process during the summer, you are able to start actually doing data collection at the start of the semester. The data collection really will depend on the type of data. If you are running an internet survey and you think there is a really good response rate, you can plan on doing that in a short time. But most of the time, if you're not able to use some consulting services, charge a lot of money for doing these kind of surveys, and they'll do it quickly. If you're doing data collection on your own, this is going to take a long time. And I would say you really do have to get it done at least before you start the semester. So that's why you're probably asking because you're asking about data in the lab setting?
Well, I don't know yet, but yes.
Okay. If it's the lab setting, it's not an area I know a lot about, but it's probably quick, right? It depends on if you're watching, if you're doing something with cultures that take a long time as opposed to you're looking at reactions of chemicals right away or something. But I think that finding secondary data, if you're doing it in a non-lab setting, rather than collecting your own survey, are much easier to go by. And there's tons of publicly available data sets almost on any topic you can think of. And again, your instructors will be good resources for that.
Kind of building on that, I would say don't be shy to ask for deadlines or meetings or with your, because I never work with kind of science experiments, but a lot of times what happens is faculty members they're busy. They have lots of things going on, and every once in a while I say, my gosh, I haven't heard from my honors thesis person in a month. Are they doing okay or whatever? Be proactive and maybe come up with a schedule that goes to how much time, by week 8 I should be, try to be in here or whatever, check in. And I don't think Kosali would mind if a student says, I want to come up with, guidelines, deadlines, so that we meet every 3 weeks, we do this, I'll get you an outline here or there. That's really helpful, because there are times I have felt badly because I just lost track of someone. They didn't contact me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, are they okay or not? Because we have so many other things to do. So I say be proactive with that, come up with a timeline, make sure that you're on schedule.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to keep in mind, because instructors do this because they love working with students who come in saying, I'm really interested in this topic, because otherwise, you're teaching to students in required classes, and this is a really great opportunity to engage with students. On the other hand, this is not something that they are required to do. This is an overload on the regular teaching. So you should think of this as something you want to make it as easy as possible for the instructor too, in setting deadlines. And so you can say during your first meeting of the semester, it'd be great if we have a discussion on what your expectations are and what might be feasible deadlines. So you set them for me, and I will try, that then becomes a more binding way for me to make sure I'm making progress. When I work with honors thesis students, and typically there'll be more than one. Like this semester I have 3, last semester probably around 3. I try to teach it like a class in the sense that we get together once a week or once every 2 weeks at a set time, and we say, here's the agenda for today. But at the start of the semester, we'll have planned out, here are the deadlines, and now it's not just to me that you're accountable to yourself as well as to your other students. So when you have a proposal or a draft, you're going to share it all around, and we're going to treat it like a small group discussion. So anything you can do to set up those infrastructure steps that make it easy for you to follow through and for your instructor to know what to expect, I think helps.
So if your thesis is based on secondary research, and so you're saying let's say you were planning on doing a thesis during the second semester, of your senior year, but you should be doing a lot of the research a semester prior. So does that mean you should begin discussing it with your faculty mentors at the beginning of the year?
I think that
only the beginning of the second.
So the semester before you are going to actually do the thesis is when it would be a good time to have at least figured out who's going to be your main mentor, what's going to be the basic topic, what are the main papers in that area they might have you read as background, and then what is the data set, or if it's a secondary data set. You might start to say, all right, I'm not going to actually start using this, but I want to be able to find papers that have used it so I can understand its limitations and its assets. Does that answer your question? So your question also brought up in my mind a distinction between what's a thesis and what's a report. So I think there's often when you think of those outlines, you can think, well, I can phrase a question and I can go answer it by reading entirely what others have written and reporting it, summarizing it. I don't need to have done data analysis of my own to be able to answer a question, because I can do it by looking at what others have already done. That is a report rather than a thesis, in the sense that you haven't contributed to pushing that field forward. You have simply summarized what already exists. So what you should aim to do in a thesis is to see how can you make a scholarly contribution to that area. You might think, oh, this seems like a minor contribution, but as long as it's a contribution that really interests you, you have gone through the steps of learning how to contribute scholarly into an area and how to complete a project. So even if you never go on to do any research afterwards, and most of the time what you're going to be doing is learning from this experience how to do a project on your own, how to have the discipline of following through when it's not a requirement. It's important to have learned the steps rather than just have to report what others have done. Yes?
Kind of going off of that, is it common or feasible to do secondary data and a lab setting, like to do both?
I see it as feasible to combine different types of methods of inquiry, like case study and secondary data, or a small panel, a small survey and more secondary. But just be aware that whatever you are setting up, you can do in a semester, because some people often come to me with great questions that they want to answer, but I think, oh, in order to answer that, it would take at least a year. And you're doing this on top of all the other classes and other responsibilities you have. So it's much better to aim to do less and to do it really well. That is, if you say, I could answer this with a combination of two, ask yourself, is it essential that I have those two, or will I do better by just focusing on one method? Like, should I just do the lab part and do it really well, rather than be trying to do a survey at the same time? A semester goes by pretty quickly. You are not trying to come up with a publishable research paper that matches what you are seeing out there. Those people who did those went through lots of more practice. This is the first experience, and this is going to teach you a ton. But you're going to be repeating this over and over again if you do go to grad school. If you go to an area where instead of being a producer of research, you are a consumer of research, this just means you'll be able to understand better what went on. When you see something reported in the news that comes from a research study, you'll have some basis for understanding what that was and understanding the limitations and the way to really understand. To interpret the results. So does anybody want to throw out for discussion a general topic they've been thinking of and see if we can make any progress on narrowing it down? Sort of as an example of how do you start out with the forest and end up with a tree?
The concept of environmental justice.
Okay, all right, great. Because when I hear that, I think, oh, that's a big umbrella, environmental justice. Okay, so now you say, all right, once you have learned about what that encompasses, you can start to think of, how can I make a contribution here? So can you tell me a little bit more about what particularly about environmental justice interests you?
Just the whole idea that there are certain pockets in almost every major metropolitan area where there are hazardous waste dumps and factories polluting significantly higher. There have been papers like that have been done in like Louisiana where they call it Cancer Alley because the members of the community are literally dying from what's around them, and it's because they're minority groups. That's just what interests me.
All right, great. All right, so in that I'm hearing possible questions around understanding how high is the correlation between the area's pollutants and the socioeconomic status of that community. You can think of lots of different ways you could take that, but I immediately am thinking, okay, data sets, where can she get some information on this? So I'm thinking down to the tract level or neighborhood level, the Census Bureau has lots of data sets about the characteristics of people who live in a certain community. They get that from the decennial censuses that are done, and out of those are produced research files that are available to us to download that have the zip code or the 5 digits, very detailed level of geography. And so you know about the neighborhood character, people who live there. Now you need another source of data, which is pollution. And there are other data sets out there that record the level of certain contaminants in the water and the air and where toxic waste sites are, down to that level of geography. So you could be looking at creating a data set that merges together the characteristics of who lives there and the characteristics of the pollution that is there, and looking at your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is you're going into it saying you think there is a very strong correlation between poverty and the existence of these pollutants. And so you'll be able to test that hypothesis with your data using a method which is, at first it would just be correlations, but you come up with a better way to test a more specific causal question, maybe looking at changes over time, maybe looking at where are new pollutants introduced. Are they the places that already had existing low socioeconomic status communities? And that would be just, so that's just one way in which you would take that big question and hone it down to a small, doable project in a semester. Sure, yeah, no, and that's why I think having these kind of conversations with people who might know data sources can help you say, is this feasible or not? So I encourage you all to have these conversations early on with your instructors, just to see, can I come up with something that is doable? Because you will feel so much better once you know there is a plan. It's not that I'm walking in saying, I want to do something on this topic and I just have no idea and I have a whole semester and you're just going to get really frustrated. I remember feeling that way. I went to my economics professor before I had decided on my topic, I think like a year before that, I said, I've heard about this thesis. I have no idea. It just sounds like such a difficult concept. How am I going to select the topic and get this product? And he said, you know, just don't think of it that way. Think of it in parts. Just come up with a question, and then the rest we'll help you with, because we know you haven't done this before. Any other types of questions, or anyone else want to throw out a topic or whatever we got, or we can go into more technical.
I wanted to follow up with the environmental justice, because I know that in my office we have deep conversations one-on-one, and when we talked about this environmental justice and then the neighborhoods getting the data set, how would you hone down the thesis question for something? If you had, just what are your thought processes on getting to that question?
I think people have different approaches. Since I'm a data and methods person, the first thing I do when someone talks to me about a topic is I try to think of a data set and go right to the method and data set. But there's a lot else that's important. You have to think about what is it in this field that is seen as the big question. And it might not be this correlation between neighborhoods. It might be a specific example. It might be how a certain pollutant is, and you might then want to look at correlations between that and diseases in that area. So then that would go towards getting data on death certificate. There's lots of mortality data that is also by disease and area. So there's a lot more that I just skipped through on thinking through what about it is important and what is the relevant current political situation or big question that's driving this. Does that help? I'm thinking.
How do you, I understand like how do you find that kind of information? How do you find data sets on like the intrinsic value that people find like say from like the arts or something like that?
Okay. So how about something that is a hard to measure concept? Like how do we know how much people value clean air or like the arts or okay. All right. So I could answer from the economics perspective. There are methods that are used to try and figure out the value of things that aren't easily quantifiable. For example, suppose that you can think of different neighborhoods, again, back to neighborhoods, and I'm going to talk now about housing values. Suppose that you have data on, and there are tons of data on the housing indexes and the value of houses, and you know the geography, and you know whether they happen to be within certain miles of performing arts centers. So a method people have used to quantify how much people value something is to say that valuation is capitalized in value of houses. So if I can show that there is a systematically higher housing price for areas that have certain amenities, and it could be anything, it could be green space, it could be cleaner water. If I control for enough other things, I should be able to tease out the part that is just due to people's valuation.
How do you measure that in comparison to like gentrification? Like if the increase in like housing and welfare hasn't pushed out the people that were already there, so maybe those people don't even have a better living. It's just new people have moved in.
Right. You would have to think then about trends over time. So you can't just do it by looking at 1 year. You'd have to see and then there's going to be lots of methods issues of what was driving what, and that gets a little more complicated. Some of those things you just have to say, I understand there are these complexities in teasing out my question, but I am going to make this following assumption. And that's what studies do when there are just things you can't deal with in a semester or with the data. You say, under these assumptions, this answer holds.
Maybe I add a little bit, because I don't use data sets at all. I've never had anybody have a question because my area is more law and legal related stuff. And I'm thinking in my last 2 theses that the question still was very, very important. You know, they find, I want to talk about consumer arbitration. I want to talk about emergency response to Katrina and how they use different dispute resolution methods and non-court ways to resolve it. And I remember having at least 2 very long meetings saying, but what is your question? What do you want to find out? We know all this background about consumer arbitration. What is it about it? You know, and we're going through all the laws, and there's Supreme Court cases going on right now, and there's unanswered questions. And once we got that question, which took probably 2-3 hours, really, 2 different things of what question do you want to answer? And it came up as simple as like, is this good public policy? Is this the best way for consumers? That's what the question was. And then things started to fall into place. It's like, you got to get we had the outline, and then when you mentioned that 15-minute a day thing, once she had a very strict outline, okay, I need some background. That's all she did. You know, that day, she got that much done, you know, and then we got this much done. And then we wanted to look at the court cases. Okay, what's the order of that? And so it kind of flowed from there. But to me, it showed the emphasis of how good the question was. The other, it was really a good thesis. I learned so much from that, where it was an emergency management interest the student had, and Hurricane Katrina and the Hurricane Sandy. There's disaster relief, and they're trying to figure out how to process claims quickly, which is alternative dispute resolution. And they were using arbitration. They had this whole, you know, so we wouldn't go into courts. So he was actually comparing how it went in Katrina the first time they used it, and then how they modified it with Sandy. And the problem with data was that it wasn't as much historical time with that, but still there was something. So it was, the question was around, you know, what have we learned from Katrina in terms of making use of this in future disasters? And it came together beautifully, but man, it took a while to get that question. It really did. But once you got it and make it manageable, things really flowed from there. And this is not using any data sets at all. It was looking at,
Right,
court
no,
cases and different
case
sources.
studies, yeah.
Yeah. So
No,
it's
I
kind of
want to
different.
emphasize that what you are doing should be, what tools you will use will be what's appropriate for that field. And I just data happens to be the one in my field, but if you're working in an area, legal analysis, you're going to be using a whole other set of types of inquiry. So,
And the contribution of the students were, and maybe, I don't know if you should do this or not, is kind of like, what did you learn? What recommendations would you make for policy? Is this good or not? What are the flaws? What do you see? What, where's the next step in evolving the thinking on this? And they contributed to that, which I thought was good. They took what they learned and said, here's, at least where I think the direction should go with the policy.
And that's good. You want this to be something, think about, again, another part of what you're getting out of this is a close working relationship with an instructor who's going to have more to go on in writing your recommendation letter than, oh, they took part in class and did great on exams. This gives them more to write about, and so the people reading it are going to say, oh, this is actually a very informative letter. It's coming from someone who's had more than just the typical classroom experience. So you want to do whatever will help your instructor write a great letter. So think about the importance of sticking to deadlines as being translated in through that letter to here's somebody you can really count on because they stick to their deadlines and they follow through and they don't bite off more than they can manage. All of those things you want, whatever it is you want reflected from your experience in the letters, you make sure it's there. You want it to be something you've contributed to, not that the instructor feels after midterms this isn't going anywhere, so I better get more involved and give you the question and give you the method.